So it always makes me very happy to chant before a Dhamma talk like that. It's hard not to smile when
Mm.
I reflect about the beauty of this practice, the value of these teachings, the importance for all of us of what the Buddha shared with all of us, and the value of the tradition, the lineage that
Yeah,
I am part of. I am very grateful to be part of. And I have to say that often when I chant the refuges and precepts, what comes through my mind is an imagined queue, a line of monastics that starts with me and goes to my teachers and their teachers and their teachers' teachers, all the way back to the Buddha. And it's just such a source of gratitude. And every single one of us that engages in this practice, that cultivates the mind, cultivates the heart, is in this queue of beings that follows the teachings of the Buddha and brings them into life, brings them alive in themselves. And I also love chanting before a Dhamma talk because it feels like I'm entering under the shade of protection of the Dhamma. So when I chant the refuges and precepts, I'm bringing to heart and mind all the beings before me that handed this practice down, and I'm asking for their protection. It really takes the pressure off. This isn't about me or anything I've come up with. This is a direct lineage that we're all in, each of us, that goes right back to the Buddha. The essence of the Buddha's teachings, no matter what tradition you are in, whether it's this Theravada lineage or a Mahayana lineage or a Vajrayana lineage, the essence of the Buddha's teaching is the cultivation of the mind and heart, the development of wisdom and compassion. So, of course, by engaging in this karuna bhavana, this cultivation of compassion, we are directly developing one of the two wings of the Dhamma, the compassion wing. And by engaging in this practice, we're not only developing compassion, but this will change our vipassana practice. So, as I said yesterday, the whole week of developing this compassion practice is about learning to be with suffering and learning to be with suffering in a balanced and useful way. And what is the first noble truth? It's the noble truth of suffering. So the more balanced we are around our own suffering and the suffering of others, the more easily we can open to it with wisdom. So there will be flow on effects of this practice that you will feel not only in terms of how you relate to other beings, but in your wisdom practice, in vipassana practice. So, as I outlined very briefly last night, we develop attitude, a particular kind of attitude of the heart when we do this practice. We develop a capacity for connection. We develop mindfulness. And through our daily activities, through action, we integrate what we have developed on the cushion into our daily life. So in formal practice, with a balanced attitude, we polish and develop that capacity for connecting with suffering. And we do this in a gradual way because at first, it might not be so easy, but as we deepen our ability to connect, the more we connect, the more we can connect. Our ability to open the heart to our own and others' suffering expands and deepens. And then our general activities, our daily life gives us a reality check, very
Yeah.
basically. So no matter how we're doing on the cushion, how deep our concentration or what we're experiencing, we see in our daily life whether or not there are still impediments to compassion. So this form of practice, a Zoom retreat, is really useful because you're at home. And being at home gives you that constant reality check because you're dealing with life. So please don't be discouraged when this happens. This is just a magnifying glass that shows you where the practice needs to work. So all that by way of context. Now I want to speak a little bit about karuna itself, compassion itself, how it is laid out in the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist psychology. So in the Abhidhamma, mind states, such as compassion, are spoken of in terms of 4 aspects. And I find this very useful because it shines a light on different aspects of that mind state. So the first of these is the characteristic. And in terms of karuna, compassion, the characteristic of compassion is said to be promoting relief from suffering. So it acts to support relief from suffering. And the second of these 4 characters, or these 4 aspects, is the function. And that's the English translation, but the Pali is rasa, which means taste. And the function, or the rasa, of karuna is not bearing the suffering of others.
Not bearing?
Not being able to witness the suffering of others without wanting to alleviate it. Basically, what this means is that when we see others suffering, we don't disengage. And we don't disengage because we cannot disengage. The heart refuses to turn away. So I see the function as it's described, not bearing the suffering of others, as a way of expressing the fact that compassion refuses to close the eyes of the heart to the suffering of others. And we have the capacity to witness suffering without drowning, getting overwhelmed, or just closing down. So the characteristic, the function, the third of these is the manifestation, how it appears in experience. And this is very simple. It's not cruelty, non-cruelty. So cruelty, being the opposite of compassion, it's something that looks at the suffering of others and going, oh, I don't care. And in fact, being willing to inflict suffering on others. But in fact, of course, compassion is the opposite of that. We are unable to do that. We just cannot. Because of the heart's inability to close its eyes to suffering, we cannot inflict it on others. So then the fourth of these 4 aspects that the Abhidhamma describes is the proximate cause. And this is the most immediate cause of suffering, or of compassion to arise. And the way it's described is the proximate cause of compassion is seeing the helplessness of those experiencing suffering. Seeing the helplessness of those experiencing suffering is the proximate cause of compassion. And in fact, seeing the helplessness of those overwhelmed by suffering, quite specifically. And when you think about this, all of these fit together like a perfect, perfectly, because if you think of times when you have actually acted from a place of cruelty, it doesn't have to be huge cruelty. It could just be killing a fly, for example. There's a lack of willingness to connect with that being's suffering. And there actually can be a resistance to letting in the helplessness of that being. And the mind can turn to cruelty. And it might not be huge, but it's the same thing. And a really good way to observe this is to observe how we relate to annoying beings, particularly annoying beings who are much smaller than we are, who might harm us, like mosquitoes, flies. And I have to say, living here in Burma, I have a continual kind of low-grade warfare going on with ants and mosquitoes. Okay. Especially mosquitoes, I find the mind can turn to cruelty very easily. So if it's a hot night, as it is right now, it's very hot, and I'm trying to get to sleep, and I hear this by my ear, I have to really suppress the impulse to go, try to catch it. I really do want to kill it. I be very honest with you. Fortunately, I have a net. So, a net where I can catch them, so I can catch it and take it outside. But to see the cruelty in the mind is very humbling. And this is in direct contrast to more developed beings, shall we say, who have more deeply developed compassion, who are able to feel deep compassion and care even for mosquitoes or flies. There's a wonderful story. I think it was Joan Halifax Roshi, an American Zen teacher, tells a story of meeting with a Tibetan Lama. And they were having tea, and a fly landed in her tea and started to drown. And witnessing this, the Lama quickly took the cup, fished the fly out, and took it outside. And she was very humbled by this because she thought, oh, he's taking the fly out because, he's afraid for my health and, he thinks I might be freaking out. But when he came back in, he said, it'll be okay. It flew away. Obviously, very glad for the well being of this fly, very genuinely and sincerely happy that the fly was okay and feeling a lot of compassion for this being who had been drowning. That's what compassion looks like when it's a default setting, when it's been deeply and strongly developed. And I'll be very honest with you, I'm not there yet. Like all of us, I'm in that middle ground where I'm not completely awake and I have work to do. But with practice, what I'm incredibly grateful for is that my default setting isn't to act on that cruelty. So I might think, mosquito, I really want to get it out of here. I wish it didn't exist. I don't act on that thought. And that's where we all are. That's what we all develop, is the ability to ignore unwholesome thoughts and not feed them. Not only not feeding them directly, but also just acknowledging, oh, this happens and it's not that big a deal. How we develop an ability to open the heart to the suffering of others is to open the heart to our own suffering and our own flaws and our own places that are not completely purified. So learning to be with suffering is learning, developing the heart and developing and integrating that in our life so that when cruelty arises in the mind, we incline instead to that manifestation of karuna that is non-cruelty. Or when we don't care about the suffering of others, we recognize that and don't act it out. So these four aspects of karuna are as valuable in their positive version as in when we see them lacking, both sides, whether we can see karuna or we see its opposite. It's very useful to have this framework. So in this regard, one aspect of karuna that is very useful is described as the near and far enemies of karuna. Many of you are familiar with these terms when we talk about the near and far enemies of metta. In the same way, we talk about the near and far enemies of compassion. So the far enemy is basically the opposite. And it's spoken of as a far enemy because it's far away from compassion. And it's the easier of the two enemies to recognize. It's very obvious. So the far enemy of compassion is, of course, cruelty. It's that moment in the mind when we look at the mosquito and go, you are my mortal enemy, I want to kill you. The far enemy is really obvious. It's really easy to see. The near enemy is harder. It's more subtle. the near enemy is something that mimics compassion, but isn't. And the near enemy of compassion is spoken of as either sorrow, in other words, when we feel grief about what is happening for somebody else, or pity. So the difference between compassion and pity, it's very subtle. Pity is when we face the suffering of somebody else and we say, oh, that poor person over there. We place ourselves at a distance, and it can be laced with sadness. So it's facing suffering, but with what we call in Pali dosa, which is aversion. It's holding ourselves at a distance, holding the suffering at a distance, pushing it away, but in a
Quindi,
very subtle way. So we might feel pity, we might feel grief when we encounter the suffering of other beings. This is not compassion. Compassion in the texts is described as the quivering of the heart in response to suffering. So we're touched, but touched in a balanced way, so that we face the suffering of others without turning away, without going to unbalance. And this equilibrium is a really important aspect of compassion. So somebody asked today, a really good question is, asked about self-pity and how does that relate to compassion? Yeah, somebody asked a really good question today about self-pity and how does self-pity relate to compassion? Commiserating with yourself. I like that.
yeah.
Self-pity is a toxic emotion, and it's the manifestation of the near enemy of compassion as it relates to ourselves. So when we look at it with regards to these four aspects, so instead of promoting relief of suffering, we are obsessing about suffering. We're going there again and again and again, and the mind will not let the suffering go. So when looked at in terms of the proximate cause, when we don't have balance, when we see our own helplessness and go out of balance with it, we actually promote more and more and more suffering because we obsess about that helplessness in an unhelpful way. And the irony of the situation is we do this because we cannot bear the suffering. We just can't face it. We can't easily be with it. It might be quite intense. And the mind, thinking in a deluded way, thinks, well, if I keep connecting with it in this way, it, this is going to solve my problem. It actually makes it worse, because when we're caught in self-pity, we're less focused on the suffering than on the self that is experiencing it. So we are observing the suffering and trying to deal with the suffering, but instead getting more and more identified with the storyline or the experience, which only promotes more and more and more suffering. It's a feedback loop. But if we're caught in this, it can be very subtle and it's hard to see. So please don't judge yourself if you're caught in a particular form of suffering again and again and again and again, and you find yourself totally identified with it. And very practically, dealing with this near enemy in the practice requires that we first recognize the state that is arisen. You can just say to yourself, oh, this is the near enemy, pity, self-pity, if it's self-pity or pity for somebody else. And in that moment, you can directly turn away from that near enemy by just saying, well, may I be at ease with this anyway? May I be free from suffering anyway? Being aware of that near enemy, being mindful of it, and connecting with the experience of suffering with the well-wishing that is compassion, that wishes for the relief of that. And particularly self-pity is something, if you label something as self-pity, the mind will drop it because we don't want to go there. Maybe just for a moment, but that's a moment of freedom. So when you get caught in the near enemy, whether it's for yourself or for another, just recognize it. That's all you need to do. Same as with the far enemy. You just recognize it, don't act on it. So I think I will stop there for today and continue this tomorrow a little bit. Shifting gears a little bit tomorrow, but leaving this basic information with you so that you know what you are cultivating. And one last thing to clarify that I think is really important that is not in the text, but is, I want to add this before I close, is the difference between compassion and empathy. And I want to go on with this tomorrow in more detail, but just to say very quickly, compassion and empathy are different. So it's really important that you understand what you are not cultivating the ability to feel the same thing that somebody who is suffering feels. You're not taking on their suffering in that way, but you're taking on the holding of that suffering with an open heart. So I leave you with those thoughts and wish you very, I'm censoring myself. I was going to say something else, but I really wish you an interesting and fruitful day of compassion practice today. And I will see all of you again tomorrow at the usual time for the group meeting. Thank you for your kind attention and thank you for your practice.